I'm Linda Calvert, Chief Diversity Officer, Vice President for Administration and Grant Development at Northeast State Community College. And today, I'm joined by Dr. Daryl Carter.
Hi, how are you today? I'm a tenured full professor of history at East Tennessee State University, where I also serve as the interim director of Africana Studies.
Well, Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us today, and we're going to talk about the women's suffrage movement, not only in Northeast Tennessee, but also the United States. So I'd like to begin our period of discussion today with your telling us about the Seneca Falls Convention and the significance of that convention for the abolitionist and the suffrage movements.
When we think about Seneca Falls, and many historians and others have labeled this as the beginning of women's rights here in the United States. When these activists, which were all white and with the exception of Frederick Douglass, met at Seneca Falls, they were pushing for white women's suffrage and for the rights of white women. And when we think about these issues of women's rights or civil rights, for the majority of American history, that has included whites, not blacks. And so the push there for women to get the right to vote, for women to be treated equally before the law, for women to have equal opportunity in public spaces was were key elements.
In general then, how would you characterize that relationship between white and black suffragists, and how did these relationships evolve over time?
These relationships were often tense, and they had to do with a lot of things. Some of it had to do with just old-fashioned bigotry and racism on the part of white women at the time. Some of them had to do with issues over disagreements about what was the best way to move forward for women's rights. Should it be a biracial coalition? Should it be just white women? Should it be black men? Should it be something else? And how do you engage politically? What's the best way to advocate and lobby people in power to affect change? And so when we think about these relationships, there's a lot of tension there, there's disagreement there, there's struggle there about how do we move forward, how are we going to get these rights, when are we going to get these rights? And don't forget, a lot of these white women in the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and 50s were not just there, pushing for their own rights. They were also pushing for the end of American slavery, in part because of the belief that if American slavery fell, then you would have an opportunity for white women in particular to gain first-class citizenship. So these relationships in the beginning are tough, they are tense, they are intense. And over time, that continues. And so beyond the American Civil War, beyond Reconstruction, as we get into the 20th century, we can see this with the passage of the 19th Amendment, where a lot of white women did not want black women to be a part of it, in part because they felt it was going to hurt them. We saw that here in Tennessee in some of the battles back and forth leading up to ratification here. And then, of course, as we get into the later part of the 20th century, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you see those tensions again, where, for example, the National Organization of Women is by and large a white organization for quite some time, excluding both intentionally at times, but also unintentionally, black women. And so there was a lot of frustration, I think, over that. And so here we are at a period in the 21st century where the issues of black women are still not the same as white women, and in many ways much more complicated, much more serious, and how we, confront, not just the issue of race, but for black women, sex and race, right? And so these relationships over time evolve, and it's much better now than what it was, say, 100 years ago, these relationships. And there's a recognition now on the part of the National Organization for Women and other groups that black women have to have a seat at the table, but it wasn't always that way.
Okay, so who were some of those prominent African American women in the women's suffrage movement?
Well, you could think about, for example, Ida B. Wells, and what she is doing, and I'm just going to focus on her, is number one, advocacy generally. Secondly, education. And three, telling about what is happening in the American South, right? What is happening? So what we're looking at there is Jim Crow. What we're looking at there is racial and sexual terrorism. What we're looking at is a South where just talking about these things can be very, very dangerous. And so eventually she's going to be run out of places like Memphis because of her activities there, because of the fact that she's detailing in her own publications what is happening to black men and to black women and to others. And so as we look at African American women and where they're at there at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is that they're engaging more and more because of the fact that black men are increasingly excluded from the public space, in part by law, but more often than not, by the end of the 1890s, by sheer violence.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the organization of black women. What were some of those organizations that were in play at that time?
When we think about, the National Association, Colored Women, we think about these local associations and groups. Now, what I want to go into there is that coming out of the Civil War, African Americans wanted to do several things. One, they wanted to relocate or re-identify family members that may not have been there when they ended. They wanted to start schools. They wanted their own churches. And to that end, their understanding of freedom was built around what they had seen around them for decades around white people. And so what came out of that in part is what some have called, myself included, the politics of respectability. And so you see associations and clubs started at local levels. You see sororities and fraternities created at the HBCUs in which they are promoting a certain vision of what a respectable black person should be and should do. So for example, to focus on the family, focus on clean homes, focus on properly raising children, church and religion, and then of course education and racial uplift, okay? And so when you get into the 1880s, 1890s, and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, colored women's groups and others, the NAACP as well, once they're founded in the early 1900s, are going to expand upon that politics of respectability, right? Of how you behave, how you carry yourself. In no small part because it's about racial uplift. It's also about not playing into stereotypes. It's also about protection of the family. And so these groups, sometimes they're church groups, sometimes they're associations, sometimes they're larger entities. But nonetheless, they are important to pushing the black community forward politically, economically, socially, and culturally.
Would you say that any one group had more impact than others?
I would look at the National Association of Colored Women. I would look at the NAACP. Those two groups, to me, long term, are going to be extremely important. But I'm not excluding others. I'm just simply putting those couple out there.
Okay. So what were the coexisting meanings of the 19th Amendment for African American women and white women?
The issue with the 19th Amendment is that it's thought of largely for white women, right? The 15th Amendment had included black men, but it provided no mechanism for the federal government to enforce suffrage for black men. And of course, black women were excluded. Here in Tennessee, there were real arguments on display in Nashville and across the state about where this legislation and where ratification was going. Racist arguments that if this passed, it would enable a black woman the right to vote. And that was something they didn't want, obviously. Many in the South at that point in time, 100 years ago. And so, the tension there is in the fact that black women are also a part of this progressive era move for greater freedom, and they're largely being pushed back, right? They're not really embraced in a way that they should be. And so for Black women, it's going to take the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for them to receive those benefits of, the franchise. And that is remarkable in the context of a country that's almost 250 years old, that it's only been in the last 55 years that legally there has been mechanisms in place to make sure that Black people and Black women can vote without obstruction. And so as we think about Black women and white women and the 19th Amendment, understand that there is hope there, there is frustration there is a desire to be included that is not fulfilled, and that it takes decades after the ratification of the 19th Amendment for Black women to have that right without fear of being lynched, fear of being raped, fear of their husbands losing their jobs or being blackballed, blackmailed, etc., or subjects of some kind of other aggression by white Americans simply because they wanted to register to vote and wanted to vote.
So, how might we initiate conversations about the past, Black women's history, their role, and our region, particularly in light of recent national events?
I think it's important, and I'm coming at this as a historian, but I would say it's important that as a society, we take into consideration all people, especially those who have been historically discriminated against and excluded and left out of the story. And so when we think about Black women, often in the American South, understand that, it was Black women who were often, nursing white babies. It was Black women who were raising white babies. Even into the 1980s and 90s, you still saw in Northeast Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee, Black women who were still caring for white families. And a clearly subservient role, but it gets more complex when you look into the relationships, but clearly they're inferior in that position compared to the people that they are working for. So it's important to acknowledge that history. It's important to acknowledge the contributions of Black women. It's important to recognize the unique position that African American women as a whole have in our society. When you think about Black men, at the end of the day, they're still men. And historically, that's benefited them. But Black women had to deal with both the issue of gender and race. And that becomes a very, tough road to hoe in the workplace and academia and society as a whole, especially when there are preconceived notions and stereotypes about Black women that are really, really destructive, really not positive. Think about ideas about, Black women being promiscuous, or Black women being asexual, or Black women being, unable to control their baser instincts, or, having too many children, or being on welfare. These stereotypes about Black women that people automatically accept as truth. And so interviewing people, talking to them, actually listening to what they have to say is important. And then, of course, from my perspective as a historian, it's also about documenting that history. And so I would encourage African American women in the region to write down their experiences, to reach out to people like myself at East Tennessee State and my colleagues in the Department of History and Africana Studies, to reach out to Northeast State and to talk to us about their experiences. See, we can sit them down, do oral histories with them, and document for posterity their experiences, and then disseminate that to the widest possible audience.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Carter. We've enjoyed these moments with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.